And now a little story from the Appleseed.
Well, it was the late 90s, and I was taking part in a poetry reading in Covent Garden in London, when a slightly inebriated older poet with eccentrically shaggy eyebrows swayed up to me and he said, "I really liked your Lord of the Dance poem." And I was thrilled because it was a poem I did a lot in those days. It was about my belief that Jesus created the world and he did so by dancing it into being. It starts, "Oh Lord, you are the dancing Lord, the swaying Lord, the swirling Lord, joy-soaked Son of the living God. You laugh and love and leap." "Yes," said the poet. He said, "I liked it so much that it inspired me to write a poem about dancing nuns." And he swayed off, and I started to laugh because I'd known a few nuns in my time, and they started to pirouette out of my subconscious and flooded my mind for weeks afterwards. I remember that when I was 6, my parents moved to a new house in the seaside village in the north of England where we lived. And just down the road from us, there was a large brick house, a convent, in which rattled 8 Holy Child Jesus nuns and 2 trainee nuns, nun wannabes. Well, my mother loved nuns. In fact, we were a good Irish Catholic family. My mother had been to a convent school, so she set out to spoil the nuns. Now, this was the mid-60s. She rented a minivan and she took all of them to see a film that had just opened, The Sound of Music. The nuns loved it. And Edelweiss and The Hills Are Alive could be heard coming from their cloisters for years afterwards. And she encouraged me to spend time there, and I loved doing so. I was just entranced by the quality of silence that flowed through their sparsely furnished home. And then also there was a wonderful smell about the place. It smelt of beeswax floor polish and incense and holiness. And I loved the nuns. There was tall, angular Sister Aloysius, who trained me for my first Holy Communion. And then there was tiny, bird-like Sister Philomena, who had a lump the size of a robin's egg on her head. Well, she taught me by example not to be so concerned about appearances. And then there was stately, statesman-like Sister Austen. She tried to teach me calligraphy, all the time telling me these incredible stories about her time as a missionary in China just at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. She'd say, I was there when the soldiers came and they took our Reverend Mother and they took her away and they shot her. And so we voted in another Reverend Mother and they took her away and they killed her also. And so we voted in another and they took her away. And she died as well. And then it was my turn. And I wasn't afraid to die. But before that could happen, the government ordered all the foreigners out of China. And I have missed China and prayed for it every day since. Well, I loved collecting things from the convent, holy statues and holy pictures, and I'd put them in my room. And when I was about 9, my mother would say that every time she went in my room, she felt as though she should genuflect and cross herself. Well, it was about that time, after one of the visits to the convent, that I came back and I said, "Mummy, I know what I'm going to do with my life." And my mother said, "Do you, darling? What? What are you going to be?" And I said, "Mummy, I'm going to be a nun." And my mother's face clouded over and she said, "Absolutely not. No," she said. "In our family," she said, "we go to convents to get a good education, to become fine young ladies. We do not become nuns." Which confused me because I knew she loved the nuns. And it still confuses me a little, but still, she clearly had other plans for my life. But even so, just before my 11th birthday, she said, "Geraldine, would you like to go away? Would you like to go to boarding school?" Now, I really wanted to go. I said, "Oh, yes, please." My parents were planning to move to Spain, which is just a short hop, skip and a jump from England. So I was excited to go, and I was really looking forward to the interview. And my mother arranged 5 different interviews, but the one that I liked from the moment I read the brochure was one called Paul's Convent, FCJ. That's the Order of Nuns, the Faithful Companions of Jesus. And it was set in a 500-year-old manor house with its own extensive parkland. And I loved it from the moment we drove through the huge black iron gates down the long winding path. There were cows on either side and enormous ancient sweeping cedar trees. And we drove up to the front of the manor house that was all brick with different colours of brick swirled in. And it had stone window ledges and mullioned windows and an enormous oval oak door. And my mother and I crunched over the gravel and we knocked on the door, and it was opened by a tall nun in full black habit. And she said, "Welcome, welcome. My name is Sister Ethna. That is like the volcano, Mount Etna, but with a th. Sister Ethna, welcome." And she swept my mother and I into the hall. I had never seen anything like the hall. It was all lined in ancient oak. There were ancient oak floorboards. All the walls were intricately carved oak. And there was an incredible smell about the place. It smelt like the convent down the road. It smelt of beeswax floor polish and incense and holiness. But there was more. When that door first opened, it was as though a wave of love had come out of that place, almost like a tsunami, and it encircled me. It was physical. I felt as though it was encircling me, picking me up and taking me in. I knew that school had chosen me. And I knew that I had to say whatever it took to go there, and my life would be completely different if I didn't go there. And I must have said the right things, because I was accepted, and I started the September after I turned 11. Well, the nuns knew when to be stern and they knew when to look away. And that wave of love that had entranced me and captured me when I went for an interview, it caught up with me my last term there when I was 15 going on 16. I had this huge desire to spend time in the chapel praying. I went to Mass every day, but I wanted more. Now, the only time that I could go was at night. Now, for the senior girls, that was us, you had to be in bed by 10 o'clock. That was lights out. You weren't allowed to speak after lights out, never mind get up out of bed. But I'm afraid I disobeyed. I would get out, I would wrap myself in my quilted dressing gown, and I'd slip down the long cold corridors to the chapel. And if any nun saw me, they would pretend that they hadn't. They would press themselves against the wall and then slip away like oiled shadows. And I would sit in the back of the chapel that was very dimly lit with low lights and candlelight. It was half light. And I would listen to the nuns chanting their holy office. Glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And I'd watch the dust motes floating through that half-light, and I would feel deeply humbled and strangely moved. Well, this went on for a few weeks, and then I said, "Oh, well, all right, Lord. Okay, then I'll do anything you want with my life." Now, that felt good. That felt good. But then I put it through the only filter that I knew, which was a Catholic filter, and I said, "Oh, well, all right, that means that I've got to be a nun." Well, that was never going to happen. Now, nuns take vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. I was 15, I just discovered boys, and I really rather liked them. And I've never been terribly good at being told what to do. And then I remembered my mother's reaction when I was 9, and I knew she'd be furious. And so I just put it out of my mind. However, the nuns had really been taken note. So one day, Sister Benignus, who of course we call Sister Big Knickers, she was in charge of polishing all those oak floors, and she would do the main floors with the machine, but not the chapel. She would do that every day, polish it on her hands and knees. She said it was her daily meditation and her gift to the Lord. Well, she looked up from the polishing one day and she said, "Geraldine," she said, "the nuns are all praying for you. We believe you're going to be a nun," which is nun speak for "you're going to be one of us. You have a vocation. This is serious." And I thanked her. But I was at the end of my term, my last term there, and I left, and I went to a sixth form college in Oxford, and I only saw Sister Ethna and a couple of the other nuns one more time. And that was my very last term at Oxford. And I heard that Sister Ethna and some of the other nuns were going to be at a charismatic conference. So they were going to be learning about the gifts of the Holy Spirit and how to worship the Lord with your whole body. Except I don't know if I knew that at the time, and even if I did, whether I would have understood. But I found out where the Mass was going to be on a Sunday, and I bicycled down there, and I got to the ancient church, and it had another oval oak door, and I rapped on the door, and eventually it was opened by a small nun. And she said, "I'm sorry, you can't come in here. This is a private conference." I said, "Well, sister, my old headmistress is in there, Sister Ethna, and I know she'd really want to see me." And it looked as though she was going to say no, so I played my trump card. I said, "And sister, I really, really want to go to Mass." Now, no nun is going to refuse a teenage girl when she says she wants to go to Mass. And so she said, "Well, all right." She said, "But it's a silent retreat, so you won't be able to speak to her. And it's in a hall. They'll be on the other side of the room, but at least you'll be able to see her." So that's what happened. She took me in. It was in a large hall. The Mass had already started. Waved at Sister Ethna, who looked very surprised. And in the middle of the Mass, at an appropriate time, Sister Ethna got up, and with two of her friends, they were all in the black habit, she looked at me very shyly, and then she went to one end of the room, and she started to dance. The three of them started to dance. Well, what they did down this corridor, down this hallway, was they ran and then they flung themselves in the air with their arms and legs out, and they dropped. And then they ran, and again they flung themselves in the air, arms and legs extended. And again they ran and they threw themselves in the air, and they looked like great black birds soaring. And again I was strangely humbled and deeply moved. But then I left academia and I lost all contact with nuns. And I went down some dark, labyrinthine paths that I know that it was the prayers of my mother, but also those nuns that stopped me going too far down, far enough that it might have been hard to come back. And so I believe it was because of those prayers, when I was in my early 30s, that wave of love caught up with me again. And I had a Damascus Road experience in a Pentecostal church, fell irrevocably in love with the Lord, gave up my PR business, went to Bible school, became a minister, and followed an old love in a new way. And then it was several years after that I did the poetry reading in Covent Garden, and I met the poet and started remembering nuns. But then I moved over here to America, and I lost contact again, even thinking about nuns, except I had a school friend who was a Facebook friend who told me, she kept me up with the news, and she told me that Poles had been sold. All the nuns were dispersed to different convents, but she gave me Sister Ethna's address. And so I wrote to her and I sent her a tape. It was a tape in those days, a tape of poems that I'd done, and included was Lord of the Dance. And I got this absolutely wonderful letter back from Sister Ethna going, "Oh, Geraldine, it was so good to hear from you. And I am delighted that you love the Lord." And I was thrilled with the tape. It was as though we were back in Poles for me to hear you doing poetry again. And I am so grateful for the prayers of those nuns, from the nuns from the convent down the road and from Poles. It must be said, though, if they had known that I was going to end up being a Pentecostal preacher, they would probably have stopped praying immediately. Or at least redirected the flow. But I'm so grateful for them. I'm so grateful for their prayers and also for their godly example. And so whenever I think of any of them, I think of them dancing.
Thanks for joining us for a little story from the Appleseed.